The rain pelted the windshield in relentless waves, reducing visibility to a kaleidoscope of watery distortions. Jack squinted, gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity. Beside him, Sarah scrolled through her phone, futilely searching for nearby gas stations. "Nothing for another 20 miles, she said, her voice tense. "We're running on fumes, Jack." As if on cue, the car sputtered and jerked forward before dying entirely. The silence was deafening, save for the rain hammering against the roof. "Of course," Jack muttered, slamming his palms against the wheel. Perfect timing. They exchanged a glance that held equal parts frustration and unease. Just as Jack was about to suggest waiting for the rain to subside, a faint glow pierced through the downpour. A flickering neon sign barely visible in the distance. "Eclipse Motel," Sarah read aloud as they approached on foot, shivering under the weight of the storm. "Doesn't exactly scream 5 stars. It screams shelter," Jack countered, gesturing toward the sagging roof of the building that seemed to lean into the darkness around it. The sign buzzed faintly, the intermittently winking out as if struggling against the night. Inside, the lobby was a relic of another era. Faded floral wallpaper, dusty chandelier swaying gently, and a reception desk guarded by an old brass bell. Behind it stood a man whose smile seemed glued to his face. It didn't touch his eyes. "Welcome," he said, his voice syrupy and slow, like it had been practiced too many times. "You'll find the Eclipse Motel unforgettable." Jack and Sarah exchanged uneasy glances, but exhaustion and desperation won out. The man handed them a rusted key attached to a heavy, chipped keychain engraved with the number 7. The room smelled of mildew and something faintly sweet, like decaying fruit. The furniture was dated but eerily familiar, as though they'd been here before. Jack shrugged it off, chalking it up to their frayed nerves. But Sarah lingered by the mirror, her reflection faintly distorted, almost hesitant. "Do you hear that?" she asked suddenly, turning to Jack. He shook his head. "Hear what?" She frowned, staring at the cracked mirror. "It sounds like someone breathing." Jack dropped their duffel bag onto the bed with a heavy thud, the old mattress creaking under the weight. The rain outside had grown into a full-blown tempest, lightning illuminating the worn curtains in quick, jagged bursts. Sarah stood by the window, watching the downpour. "It feels wrong here," she said softly, her breath fogging the glass. "It's just a rundown motel," Jack replied, shrugging as he rummaged through the bag. "We'll sleep, get gas in the morning, and be out of here before sunrise." But even as he spoke, he didn't quite believe it. Something about the room made the air feel heavier, like they'd walked into a space that hadn't been opened in years. He glanced at the bedside table. A faded Bible sat next to an old rotary phone, its receiver coated in a thin layer of dust. "Does this place even have Wi-Fi?" Jack joked, trying to lighten the mood. The strained laugh he forced out died in the silence. Sarah didn't answer. She had moved to the bathroom, with the sound of water dripping echoed faintly. The sink faucet was off, but a steady plink-plink filled the tiled space. "Jack," she called, her voice unusually sharp. "Come here." Jack joined her, peering into the dim bathroom light. She pointed to the mirror. Written across the fogged surface, as if someone had breathed on it, was a single word. "Stay." Jack frowned, swiping his hand across the glass, but the word remained etched into the fog. "It's a prank," he said, though his voice betrayed uncertainty. "The owner must do it to spook guests. And the mirror just happened to fog up while we're here?" Sarah's voice wavered. Before Jack could answer, a loud thump reverberated through the room, making them both jump. It came from the other side of the wall, the adjoining room. Jack moved toward the wall, pressing his ear against the faded wallpaper. Another thud followed, then a dragging sound, slow and deliberate. It stopped just as quickly as it had started. "I'll go talk to the guy at the desk," Jack said, his voice edged with unease. "Maybe someone's messing around." Sarah grabbed his arm. "Don't leave me here." Jack hesitated, but the fear in her voice pushed him to nod. Together, they stepped into the dimly lit hallway. The rain outside rattled against the building, and the faint hum of a fluorescent light overhead buzzed like static. As they walked, the smell hit them first, sour, like rotting wood and spoiled meat. Jack gagged, covering his nose. Sarah stumbled, gripping his arm. "Do you see that?" she whispered. A faint smear of something dark and wet stretched across the hallway carpet, leading toward the far end, where the flickering exit sign cast the wall in an eerie red glow. At the same time, the door to room 8, the room adjacent to theirs, was slightly ajar. Inside, something shifted in the shadows. Jack's hand tightened around Sarah's. "We'll just ask the owner to call the cops," he whispered. "This place is creeping me out." As they passed room 8, Sarah glanced inside and gasped. Jack turned, his stomach lurching as he saw what she did. A photograph pinned to the back wall. It showed two smiling faces, standing in front of a car that looked alarmingly familiar. It was them, and the photo was dated 1973. Jack and Sarah stood frozen, their reflections in the cracked glass of the photograph almost mocking them. The date, 1973, burned into their minds, impossible to ignore. "This doesn't make sense," Sarah whispered. "That photo, it's us. But how?" Jack grabbed her hand, pulling her away from the room. "I don't know, but we're finding the owner. Now!" They hurried down the hallway, the hum of the buzzing lights overhead growing louder with every step. As they reached the lobby, the motel owner stood behind the desk, his frozen smile waiting for them like it had never left. His waxy face seemed almost too still, as though his skin wasn't real, but a poorly made mask. "We need to talk," Jack said, trying to keep his voice steady. "What's going on in room 8? And why the hell is there a photo of us in there?" The man tilted his head slightly, his grin stretching wider. "Ah, room 8. Quite the popular one. Lots of memories in there." "That's not an answer," Sarah snapped. Her fear had turned to anger, her hands trembling at her sides. "What's going on here?" The owner's gaze didn't falter. "Guests often see things that feel familiar, nostalgic even. It's the charm of the Eclipse Motel, a place to reflect." "Reflect on what?" Jack demanded. "That picture was dated 1973. We weren't even born then." The owner chuckled, a dry, rasping sound like leaves crumbling in the wind. "Time is such a slippery thing here. It bends and folds like paper. You'd be surprised what you can see if you look closely enough." Sarah's voice broke. "We're leaving." "Of course," the owner said, gesturing toward the door with an elegant sweep of his hand. "But you'll find the road is a fickle thing tonight. Sometimes it leads you back to where you started." Jack and Sarah exchanged a glance, the weight of his words sinking in. Without another word, they turned and walked toward the door. But as Jack grabbed the handle, he stopped short. It wouldn't budge. He yanked harder, but the door remained firmly shut, as though sealed by an invisible force. The owner's voice called from behind them. "Leaving isn't always as simple as it seems." Jack spun around, his temper flaring. "What the hell is going on here? Let us out." The owner's smile remained unchanged. "You checked in. Room 7 is yours for the night. Perhaps you should return there. Get some rest. The storm will pass." Jack took a step toward him, his fists clenched. "You think this is funny? Open the damn door." But the man didn't flinch. His glassy eyes seemed to stare through Jack, unblinking. "Room 7 is waiting," he said, his voice unervingly calm. "It's best not to keep it waiting too long." Sarah grabbed Jack's arm. "Jack, stop. Let's go back." Jack hesitated, but finally relented, his shoulders slumping in defeat. As they walked back to the hallway, the sound of the storm outside seemed to grow louder, almost drowning out the pounding of their hearts. When they reached room 7, the door was open, though neither of them had left it that way. Jack stepped inside first, flipping the light switch, but the room remained dark. Sarah followed, glancing nervously behind her, as though expecting to see someone, or something, following them. The door closed on its own with a soft click, and the room plunged into silence. Jack's voice broke the quiet. "We're leaving first thing in the morning. I don't care if I have to break a window." But Sarah wasn't listening. Her gaze was locked on the mirror, where their reflections stared back, except they weren't moving. Their mirrored selves stood unnaturally still, watching them with cold, glassy eyes. Slowly, Their reflections raised their hands, fingers tapping against the glass in unison. A single word appeared on the foggy surface between them. Stay. Jack lunged forward and yanked the motel's tattered bedspread off the mattress, throwing it over the mirror in one quick motion. The muted tapping sound from the reflections stopped instantly, leaving only the relentless drum of rain against the window. That thing's done enough, Jack muttered, his voice cracking under the weight of his nerves. We'll figure this out, but not with that thing watching us. Sarah didn't reply. She stood frozen, her eyes fixed on the covered mirror, as though it could still see her through the fabric. Jack moved toward her, placing his hands on her shoulders. Sarah, look at me. We'll be okay. Her lips quivered. It was us, Jack. It was us. And they weren't us at the same time. Jack nodded grimly, steering her away from the mirror and toward the bed. Just sit down. We'll ride this out. He wasn't sure if he believed his own words, but he had no better plan. The motel was wrong. Everything about it felt wrong, but he didn't know how to fight something he couldn't see or understand. He glanced toward the door. Leaving hadn't worked. They needed answers. I'm going back to the lobby, Jack said. Maybe I can force the truth out of that freak behind the desk. Sarah grabbed his arm with surprising force. You're not going anywhere, Jack. That thing, that owner, he's not normal. He knows what's happening here. He's part of it. I'll be fine, Jack said, though doubt laced his voice. Just lock the door behind me, okay? She didn't let go. I'm coming with you. Jack started to argue, but thought better of it. Phoenix, let's stick together. They opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The sour, rotting smell from earlier had grown stronger, curling their noses and making their stomachs churn. The buzzing overhead lights flickered erratically, casting the long corridor into fragmented shadows. As they neared the lobby, Jack stopped short. The desk was empty. The owner was gone, but the air felt alive with a sinister energy. The guest ledger sat open, its pages yellowed and curling at the edges. Jack leaned over it cautiously, his eyes scanning the names. Sarah gasped. Look! Her finger hovered over a line near the bottom of the page. Written in spidery black ink were two names, Jack and Sarah Larson. The date next to it was tonight's date. What the hell? Jack whispered, flipping through the other pages. They were filled with names, some crossed out in heavy, jagged strokes. Next to some of the entries were strange notes. Left through the mirror. Consumed by the storm. Stayed forever. A faint laugh broke the silence, and both Jack and Sarah turned sharply. The motel owner now stood in the far corner of the room, his unnervingly wide grin unchanged. His hands were folded neatly in front of him, his pale fingers drumming against each other rhythmically. You're starting to see, aren't you? He said, his voice a low, mocking hum. Jack moved forward, his fists clenched. You think this is a game? What is this place? The owner tilted his head, as if amused. This is the Eclipse Motel, of course. A place for travelers. For those passing through. Passing through what? Sarah demanded. His smile widened. Whatever comes next. Before either of them could respond, a loud creak echoed from behind them. They turned to see the hallway stretching unnaturally, growing darker with every inch. Their room was no longer visible. Instead, the hall now ended in a massive floor-to-ceiling mirror. The motel owner's voice followed them as the light dimmed around them. Some guests find their way out. Others find what's waiting for them. Jack grabbed Sarah's hand, pulling her back toward the desk. But the room was changing, the walls rippling like water. The mirror at the end of the hall shone brighter, casting eerie reflections across the walls and floor. In its surface, Jack and Sarah could see distorted versions of themselves, beckoning them closer with slow, deliberate waves. Stay, their reflections mouthed silently. Stay. Jack and Sarah stood paralyzed, their distorted reflections in the mirror drawing them closer with every passing second. The glass shimmered like liquid, rippling faintly as though waiting for them to step through. We're not going in there, Sarah whispered, gripping Jack's arm so tightly her nails dug into his skin. There has to be another way out. Jack looked around frantically, but the hallway had closed in behind them, the path back to the lobby swallowed by darkness. The only light came from the mirror, casting an eerie glow over their faces. "Do you see another way?" Jack asked, his voice taut. "Because I don't." Sarah shook her head, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "That thing, it's a trap." Before Jack could respond, their reflections moved again, this time stepping forward without them. Jack watched in horror as his mirror self placed a hand against the glass and leaned forward, as though pressing its face against an invisible barrier. It grinned, its teeth unnaturally sharp, and mouthed a single word. "Come." Jack stumbled back, dragging Sarah with him. "We're not going near that thing." But the mirror wasn't waiting for them to decide. The glass began to bulge outward, its surface warping as if something was trying to break through. Cracks spidered across the surface, and with a sound like splintering ice, a hand shot out. Sarah screamed, stumbling away as the hand, a warped, grotesque version of her own, reached for her. Jack grabbed her, yanking her back just as the hand withdrew. The mirror rippled violently, its surface returning to an unsettling stillness. "We can't stay here," Jack said, his voice trembling. "If that thing wants us, we can't let it take us." Sarah hesitated, staring into the mirror. Her reflection stared back, its eyes wide and glistening. "But what if it's the only way out?" she said, her voice barely audible. Jack turned to her, incredulous. "Are you hearing yourself? That thing isn't a way out. It's a death sentence." But Sarah didn't respond. Her gaze was locked on the mirror, which now showed something else. A glowing door at the far end of a long, empty corridor. The reflection of the door shone like a beacon, casting its light over the distorted images of Sarah and Jack. "Do you see that?" she whispered. "It's showing us the way." Jack followed her gaze, his brow furrowing. "It's showing us what it wants us to see." A low hum began to fill the air, vibrating through the walls and floor. The mirror pulsed with light, and the reflections of Jack and Sarah began to move again, this time stepping into the glowing corridor without hesitation. Their mirror selves reached the door and paused, turning back to stare at the real Jack and Sarah with expectant expressions. The humming grew louder, more insistent. Jack's fists clenched. "This is a trick. That door isn't real." "Then what do we do?" Sarah shot back, tears streaming down her face. "Sit here and wait for whatever this place really wants?" The mirror pulsed again, the door's glow growing brighter. Jack swore under his breath. He hated this every part of it, but Sarah was right. There were no other options. He reached for her hand. "If we go together." Sarah nodded, her grip tightening around his fingers. Together, they approached the mirror, the glass cool and unnervingly smooth under their touch. The surface rippled at their contact, pulling them forward like quicksand. With a deep breath, they stepped through. On the other side, the air was thick and damp, clinging to their skin like a shroud. The hallway stretched endlessly before them, the glowing door far in the distance. Behind them, the mirror had vanished, leaving only darkness. "Where are we?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Jack shook his head. "I don't know." But as they began to walk, their footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence, the walls around them began to shift. Images emerged from the shadows, familiar faces and scenes from their lives, distorted and grotesque. They were no longer just walking toward the door. They were walking through their past. Jack and Sarah pressed forward, the glowing door at the far end of the hallway seeming to recede with every step. The walls shifted and churned, spilling flickering images into the dark. Sarah stopped abruptly, her breath catching in her throat. That's me," she whispered. Jack turned to see what she was staring at. The wall beside her was showing a scene from Sarah's childhood. A young girl sitting in her bedroom, clutching a stuffed bear, while muffled yelling echoed from behind the door. The girl's face was streaked with tears. "It's just a memory," Jack said, pulling her away. "Don't let it get to you." But as they moved on, the walls grew more vivid, more insistent. The hallway turned into a twisted museum of their lives. Jack saw himself as a teenager, standing on the side of a highway, his car crumpled into a tree. He remembered the accident, the blood, the fear. But seeing it play out now was like reliving the worst night of his life. "I don't like this," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "It's like it knows." "It does know," Jack said grimly, his eyes fixed ahead. "It's using us against ourselves." Another scene emerged to their left. This time it was Sarah as an adult, standing over a hospital bed. The figure lying on it was a frail, older woman, her face pale and sunken. Sarah's face twisted in grief as she held the woman's hand. "Mom," Sarah whispered, her knees buckling. Jack caught her, steadying her as tears welled in her eyes. "It's not real, Sarah. It's just this place playing games." But Sarah shook her head. "It's not just playing games. It's feeding on us." Jack froze, her words sinking in like a cold blade. The motel, the mirror, everything about this place seemed designed to evoke fear, regret, and pain. But for what purpose? "Then we don't give it what it wants," Jack said firmly. "No matter what we see, we don't stop." They continued walking, their pace quickening as the memories grew more intense. The walls closed in, the air thick with echoes of laughter, screaming, and sobbing. The glowing door seemed to taunt them, still impossibly far away. Jack stopped suddenly, his face pale. On the wall to their right, a memory of his own played out. It showed him in a hospital room, sitting alone with his head in his hands. Beside him, a small crib stood empty. "No," he muttered, stepping back. "Not that. Not now." "Jack," Sarah asked, her voice full of concern. But Jack couldn't speak. He couldn't look away from the scene as it replayed the moment that had haunted him for years. The day he lost the child he never had a chance to know. Sarah grabbed his arm, her voice firm. "Jack, we have to keep moving. It's what this place wants, to trap us in our worst moments." Jack swallowed hard, forcing himself to turn away. The memory faded as they stepped forward, but the weight of it lingered. He didn't speak, his jaw set in grim determination. As they neared the door, the memories became darker, more fragmented. Shadows swirled in the corners of their vision, whispering unintelligible words that sent chills down their spines. The glowing door now flickered like a dying flame, its light pulsing weakly. Finally, they reached it. Jack placed a hand on the door, glancing back at Sarah. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with equal parts hope and dread. "Ready?" he asked. She nodded, though her trembling hands betrayed her fear. Together, they pushed the door open and stepped through. On the other side was a vast, empty room, the air cold and sterile. A single chair sat in the center, facing a wall-sized mirror that reflected the room back perfectly. Except, in the reflection, Jack and Sarah were missing. Instead, two dark, twisted figures sat in their places, their heads turning slowly toward the real Jack and Sarah. Jack and Sarah stared at the figures in the mirror, their grotesque features barely recognizable as distorted versions of themselves. Their reflections grinned, their mouths stretching unnaturally wide, as if mocking their fear. "Jack," Sarah's voice trembled. "What are those things?" "I don't know," he said, his throat dry. "But they're not us." The figures stood in unison, their movements jerky, as if marionettes controlled by an unseen hand. They stepped closer to the mirror's surface, their empty eyes locked on Jack and Sarah. "Don't let them out," Jack said, moving protectively in front of Sarah. The air in the room grew thick, the hum of unseen energy vibrating through their bodies. The mirror rippled like water, and the figures reached out, their hands pressing against the glass. Cracks formed around their palms, spreading outward in jagged lines. "They're trying to break through," Sarah cried. Jack grabbed the chair from the center of the room and hurled it at the mirror. The chair struck the glass with a deafening crash, shattering it into countless shards that rained down like silver needles. The figures vanished in an instant, leaving only the empty frame of the mirror behind. For a moment, there was silence, broken only by their ragged breathing. "Did we stop it?" Sarah whispered. Jack didn't answer. He was staring at the shards of glass scattered across the floor. Each fragment reflected not the room, but something else. Visions of dark, endless corridors, figures lurking in the shadows, and a storm that raged in the distance. No, Jack said finally, his voice hollow. It's not over. The door behind them slammed shut, and the room began to shift. The walls bent and twisted, the floor cracking open to reveal an abyss of swirling darkness beneath their feet. The air was filled with the sound of whispers, thousands of voices speaking in a language neither of them could understand. Sarah clutched Jack's arm. What do we do? Jack glanced around, his mind racing. The room was collapsing around them, the fragments of the mirror vibrating on the floor as though alive. In the center of the broken glass, a faint glow began to pulse, a circle of light that grew brighter with each beat. That's the way out, Jack said, pointing to the glowing circle. It has to be. Sarah hesitated, her eyes darting to the shifting walls and the dark abyss below. What if it's another trap? Jack turned to her, his face grim. Do we have a choice? Together, they ran toward the light, the floor buckling beneath them as they moved. The glowing circle pulsed with an intense brightness, and as they reached it, they felt the ground give way completely. They fell. The fall seemed endless, their bodies weightless as they tumbled through the void. Jack reached for Sarah, and their hands found each other, gripping tightly. Around them, images flickered in the darkness, moments from their lives, distorted and fragmented. Finally, they landed with a jarring thud on solid ground. The room they found themselves in was identical to the one they had just left, but the mirror was whole again. This time, it reflected not distorted figures, but something far worse. Jack and Sarah themselves, standing frozen in terror. Except, their reflections weren't moving. Instead, the mirror Jack and Sarah stood motionless, their eyes wide and unblinking, mouths slightly open as though screaming silently. Jack stepped closer, his heart pounding. The reflection of himself leaned forward, its expression shifting into something twisted and cruel. It mouthed a single word, "Run." Jack staggered back from the mirror, his reflection's silent warning echoing in his mind. He turned to Sarah, who stood frozen, her wide eyes locked on her own mirrored self. "Sarah," Jack said, grabbing her arm. "We need to go." She didn't move. "It's us, Jack," she whispered. "But it's not us. They're trapped in there, or waiting to get out." Jack shook her gently, trying to snap her out of it. "We can't stay here. You saw what it said, run." The room began to vibrate, the walls pulsating like they were alive. A low, guttural sound filled the air, growing louder with every passing second. The mirrors started to crack, just as it had before, thin lines spidering outward from its center. "Jack," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the rising noise. "What if running is what it wants us to do?" Before he could answer, the cracks in the mirror widened, and black liquid began to seep through, pooling on the floor. The liquid moved unnaturally, creeping toward them in tendrils that writhed like living things. "Run!" Jack shouted, pulling Sarah toward the door. They bolted, the tendrils of liquid slithering after them. The hallway outside had changed. No longer the eerie, flickering corridor of the motel. It now stretched endlessly in both directions, lined with doors that rattled violently, as if something behind them was trying to get out. "Which way?" Sarah cried, panic rising in her voice. Jack didn't hesitate. "Forward!" They sprinted down the hallway, the rattling doors blending with the roar of the black liquid surging behind them. The light overhead dimmed with every step, plunging them deeper into shadow. One of the doors burst open as they passed, and a figure lunged out. A pale, hollow-eyed man who grabbed at Sarah with a twisted, claw-like hand. She screamed, twisting away, and Jack shoved the figure back into the room, slamming the door shut. "They're everywhere!" Sarah yelled, tears streaming down her face. "Just keep going!" Jack shouted. Ahead, the hallway began to narrow, the walls closing in as if the building itself was alive and trying to trap them. The black liquid gained on them, spilling into the narrowing space and forcing them to climb over one another to avoid it. Then, suddenly, they saw it. Another door at the end of the corridor, its frame glowing faintly. "There!" Jack pointed, adrenaline propelling him forward. The tendrils of liquid surged faster, reaching for their legs. One caught Sarah's ankle, yanking her down with terrifying strength. She screamed, clawing at the floor as it began to drag her back. "Jack!" He turned in dove, grabbing her arms and pulling with everything he had. The liquid was cold and slick, stinging his skin where it touched him. Slowly, inch by inch, he managed to drag Sarah free, the black tendril snapping back like a recoiling snake. "Move!" Jack shouted, pulling her to her feet. Together, they stumbled toward the glowing door, the liquid now flooding the entire hallway. They reached it just as the first wave of blackness surged up behind them. Jack threw the door open, and they tumbled through. They landed hard on damp, uneven ground. When Jack looked up, he realized they were outside, or something that looked like outside. The sky was pitch black, devoid of stars or a moon. The air was heavy with mist, and the only light came from a single sign flickering faintly in the distance. "Eclipse Motel," Sarah read aloud, her voice trembling. Jack's stomach dropped. The building before them was identical to the one they'd just escaped, but it was far more decrepit, its windows shattered, its walls covered in creeping vines. "No," Jack whispered. "No, no, no." Behind them, the door they'd just come through slammed shut, disappearing into the ground as if it had never been there. "Jack," Sarah said, pointing. In the shattered window of the motel, two figures stood watching them, their own reflections, staring back with that same twisted grin. Jack and Sarah stood in stunned silence, the flickering Eclipse Motel sign casting an eerie glow over their surroundings. The figures in the shattered window didn't move, their grins frozen in place like a grotesque portrait. "This can't be real," Sarah murmured, her voice trembling. "We got out. We're out." Jack shook his head, his gaze locked on the reflection. "We didn't get out. It's the same place, just worse." The air felt alive with tension, each second stretching unbearably. Behind them, the endless darkness seemed to press closer, as though urging them forward. "What do we do?" Sarah asked, her voice laced with desperation. Jack clenched his fists, his mind racing. "We can't keep running. It doesn't matter where we go. It'll just lead us back here. We have to stop this." Sarah turned to him, her eyes wide. "Stop it? How? You saw what this place is. It's alive, Jack. It's something else." "Maybe," Jack said, his voice hardening. "But everything has a weakness. Even this." He pointed toward the shattered window where their reflections waited. "That's the key. We have to face them." Sarah hesitated, glancing back at the encroaching darkness. "And what if we're wrong? What if it just makes things worse?" Jack grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to meet his gaze. "If we don't do this, we'll be stuck here forever. We have to try." With reluctance, Sarah nodded, and together they approached the crumbling motel. The door creaked open as they neared, swinging inward to reveal the same dimly lit lobby they'd fled hours, or was it days, ago. The inside was worse than before. The walls were warped and peeling, the air thick with the smell of decay. Shadows danced along the edges of the room, moving in ways that defied logic. The figures from the window were waiting for them, standing motionless at the far end of the room. Their twisted grins and unblinking eyes seemed to follow Jack and Sarah's every move. "What now?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the low hum that filled the air. Jack took a shaky step forward. "We confront them. No running, no hiding. If this place feeds on fear, we starve it." The words felt hollow as he said them, but he forced himself to keep walking. The closer he got to the figures, the heavier the air became, pressing against him like an invisible weight. Finally, he stood face to face with his reflection. It was identical to him in every detail, except for the eyes. They were darker, almost black, and seemed to radiate malice. "Why?" Jack asked, his voice trembling. "Why are you doing this to us?" The reflection tilted its head, its grin widening. "We are you," it whispered, its voice distorted and echoing. "Your pain, your guilt, your regrets. We are everything you hide from the world. You're nothing," Jack spat, his anger rising. "You're just a shadow." The reflection laughed, a sound that echoed through the room like shattering glass. Then what does that make you? Jack hesitated, the words cutting deeper than he expected. But Sarah stepped forward, her voice firm despite the fear in her eyes. You're wrong, she said. You're not us. You're just pieces of us. Pieces we've already left behind. The reflections faltered, their grins faltering for the first time. The room seemed to ripple, the shadows retreating slightly. Jack took Sarah's lead, stepping closer to his reflection. We're not afraid of you, he said, his voice steady now. You don't control us. You never did. The reflections began to twist and distort, their forms breaking apart like smoke caught in a windstorm. The motel shook violently, the walls cracking and crumbling as the figures dissolved into nothingness. The low hum turned into a deafening roar, and the floor beneath them began to collapse. Jack grabbed Sarah's hand, pulling her back toward the door. Go, he shouted. They ran, the motel falling apart around them. The flickering sign exploded in a shower of sparks as they burst through the front door and into the darkness beyond. When they finally stopped running, the silence was absolute. Jack and Sarah looked around, finding themselves standing in the middle of an empty highway. The stars shone brightly overhead, the storm long gone. It's over, Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. Jack nodded, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. Let's keep moving, he said, taking her hand. We're not staying here. They walked down the road, the faint outline of the motel now just a speck in the distance. Jack and Sarah walked in silence, their footsteps echoing faintly against the empty highway. The night air was cool, carrying the faint scent of rain-soaked asphalt. The oppressive darkness that had surrounded the motel was gone, replaced by a vast, star-speckled sky. Do you think it's really over? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack hesitated, glancing back over his shoulder. The road stretched endlessly into the horizon, devoid of any sign of the motel. I don't know, he admitted, but we're out of there. That's what matters. They pressed on, the distant sound of crickets and rustling trees offering a fragile sense of normalcy. The tension in their chests began to ease with each step, though neither of them dared to say it aloud. After what felt like hours, they spotted a faint glow ahead, the warm, golden lights of a gas station. Relief surged through them like a breaking wave. Finally, Sarah said, her voice shaking. Something real. As they approached, the hum of a fluorescent sign became audible, and Jack felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The sign above the gas station read, Last Stop. The knot in his stomach grew tighter as they entered the station, greeted by the fluorescent buzz and the smell of stale coffee. A lone attendant stood behind the counter, flipping through a magazine. He was an older man with a weathered face, but his eyes, they seemed too bright, too alert. Evening, the man said, his voice gruff but polite. Long night? Jack nodded, glancing around the station. It looked ordinary enough. Rows of snacks, a wall of fridges stocked with drinks, and a dusty radio playing faint country music. Yeah, Sarah said, forcing a small smile. You could say that. The attendant nodded knowingly. Well, you made it this far. That's something. Jack froze, his eyes narrowing. What's that supposed to mean? The attendant chuckled, setting his magazine down. Just making conversation. Folks don't usually come through here unless they're on a journey of sorts. Sarah exchanged a wary glance with Jack. A journey to where? The man leaned on the counter, his gaze settling on them with a weight that made Jack's skin crawl. That depends, he said simply. Jack stepped forward, his hands balling into fists. Depends on what? The man's smile was faint, almost apologetic. Depends on whether you're running from something or toward it. Before Jack could respond, Sarah grabbed his arm. Let's just go. We don't need anything. Jack nodded reluctantly, but as they turned to leave, the man called after them. Be careful out there, he said. The road has a way of circling back on itself. Jack didn't look back, his jaw clenched as they pushed through the door and back into the night. The highway stretched ahead, illuminated by the faint glow of the gas station behind them. Sarah's grip on his arm tightened. Jack, she whispered, didn't he look familiar? Jack shook his head. unwilling to entertain the thought. Let's just keep moving. They walked in silence, the road ahead shrouded in shadow. The air grew heavier with each step, and Jack found himself glancing over his shoulder despite himself. The gas station lights were gone now, swallowed by the night. "Do you hear that?" Sarah asked suddenly, stopping in her tracks. Jack listened, his heart pounding. At first, there was nothing, only the faint rustling of the wind. But then he heard it, the distant hum of a flickering neon sign. "No," Jack whispered, shaking his head. "We left it behind." The hum grew louder, and as they turned a corner in the road, a familiar glow came into view. The Eclipse Motel sign buzzed faintly, its cracked neon letters casting an eerie light on the building below. Sarah's voice broke into a sob. "We can't be back. We can't." Jack stared at the motel, his mind reeling. This isn't possible. But the door to the motel creaked open slowly, a faint, distorted voice echoing from within. "Welcome back." Jack took Sarah's hand, squeezing it tightly. "We'll keep walking," he said. "No matter what, we'll keep walking." And so they did, their footsteps fading into the endless night, the motel's glow ever present behind them, a reminder that some doors are never fully closed.